Good morning, everyone. And I'd like to say that it's a pleasure to be here, but at the minute it doesn't quite feel like that. However, I would like to say a very special thank you to Kenda for that very kind introduction. And as she said, she did have to work her way through my thesis in detail, and I am indebted to her for that. So, to talk to you today about my research, the nature and manifestations of bullying in midwifery. So where did this all come from? So I'll start with a little bit of the background, and if we look back in the literature, which as a good PhD student, of course you all will, you'll look back to 1996, and really that was one of the first pieces of research that by the RCM, and they looked at bullying in midwifery. And they identified that it was indeed a very stark reality for many midwives at that time. And Cecily Begley in the south of Ireland, some of you may be familiar with her work, she looked at what sometimes student midwives are exposed to as they go through their education programme. And while she wasn't looking specifically at bullying, some of the behaviours that her student midwives described to her were those that were very similar to, or exactly could be described as, bullying behaviour. Ball et al., and that was Mavis Kirkham was involved in that work, you may be more familiar with her, but they looked at the reasons why midwives leave the profession of midwifery. And bullying was right up there as one of the reasons why people not only leave their jobs, but actually just leave midwifery. Say, I've had enough, and go. So, my research then really, I wanted to explore the phenomenon of bullying. While there was some information out there, it was fairly limited really. So I needed to explore it further, and I think the electricity has just gone up. But I'm sure we'll be fine. The switch isn't turned on, I think that's what it is.
The battery's just turned on, is it, Patricia?
Yeah, it's alright.
It isn't turned on.
It's alright. It's alright, it's going to charge up again. That's alright, it gives me a wee minute to gather my thoughts. Yeah, that would be lovely. Oh, here, there's one here. Thank you, Arlette. Okay, so my aim then was to explore the phenomenon of bullying as experienced by midwives in practice. And in order to do this, it's quite a complex thing to do. Thanks, Arlette. I used a mixed method approach to capture, obviously not only in figures, which sometimes people prefer to deal with, but I thought because of the very nature of this subject, it was really important to get the words that help describe this concept of bullying. So, ethical considerations, particularly, with all research that deals with the health and well-being of individuals or explores or deals with individuals and persons and human beings, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. It's important that we give due consideration to any benefits and risks that the research may have on those people that are involved. So it was therefore important to have ethical approval, which, I was in some ways, I suppose, quite lucky because I got in there before the OREC, and it was a slightly less onerous process than the process that many MSc and PhD students have to undertake at the minute. No less, it was really quite rigorous. So, the phases of my study. It was important because I had so many different aspects that I wanted to carry through, and it was an exploratory piece of work. There needed to be more than one phase to this piece of work. Underpinning all of that, of course, there is the literature review, and that on goes right throughout. So you start at the very beginning to get your ideas together, but you continually have to trawl around in the database trying to pick up the latest what's said, and that continues right through until you're writing up. So these 4 phases of research then. Sorry, I'll just talk to you first. I think it's important to say I needed to have a starting point, and that's what the literature, I suppose, brought out for me. It brought out this definition of bullying. And the one that I sat with, there were lots of ones written within various different types of workplaces, from backgrounds in Europe, from backgrounds in the USA. But the one that I chose to start off with was the one that had been used by the RCM in 1996. And it identified bullying in midwifery as persistent, offensive, these words are quite hard to say actually, offensive, abusive, intimidating, malicious, insulting behaviour, abuse of power, unfair penal sanction. They make the recipient feel upset, they feel threatened, humiliated, vulnerable, and it undermines their self-confidence and may cause them to suffer stress. Imagine that. So that was my starting point. And as good PhD students, and I was very interested to hear what Sheila had to say earlier about theoretical frameworks, that was one of my great challenges within my PhD, as George and Marlene will both know. But it was very important that your theoretical framework has to emerge from the literature that you review. And it has to give you some sort of framework, as that sort of picture frame that Sheila talked about earlier. And I identified from the literature that there were 3 sort of stages to this bullying. And they really were the pre-bullying stages, and that was sort of the reasons, if you could call them that, as to why bullying happens. Then there were descriptions of the sort of bullying behaviours that people were exposed to. And then lastly, the effects, the post-bullying stage, what happens to people after. And some would call that the consequences of the bullying. So it really was quite an open framework. It was there, but I wanted to fill in, and that was the important bit. My research was going to help to fill that in some way, fill in that picture, give it more colour, give it more life. So the first phase then, as I mentioned earlier, was telephone interviews. And this was my sort of feeling around stage, a pilot study really, to see whether or not midwives would talk to me. Because I wasn't sure that people would be willing to talk to me about whether this really traumatic thing that maybe perhaps had happened to them, or whether it was just all something in my head that I believed happened, and did it exist, was it really out there? And the reality was that yes, it was. I spoke to midwives, and I identified them through snowball sampling. I spoke to one and they said, oh, perhaps you could speak to someone else. And they were midwives from both clinical and academic background, and they were able to say to me, Patricia, bullying is out there. And they were able to give me very clear examples of how bullying had impacted on them. And interestingly, for those midwives, the major impact for all of them was that they left those jobs. They didn't leave midwifery, thankfully, but they did leave those jobs to get away from the bully, and they moved somewhere else. So the concept analysis. This was really to look at ways in which to look and explore the concept of bullying in depth. And Avant and Walker have an 8-stage step framework that they use, which allows you to look at it very deeply and clearly, and sort of pull bullying apart and put it back together again, is the way I think about it. Not very academic, but there you are. It identified 4 defining attributes of bullying. The first of these was the repeated nature of bullying. This sort of one-off thing doesn't really count. You might walk away and think, I didn't like that. But if it doesn't happen again, it doesn't have a lasting effect on you usually. It's when the nature of the behaviour, or the behaviour that you're exposed to, and it may be different behaviours, it doesn't always have to be the same thing, happens more than once, continually, persistently, over a period of time. And it has a negative effect on you. And I hate that word victim, but I'm not quite sure that we ever will find another word that quite describes how awful people who have been bullied can feel. So it has a negative effect on the person who has been bullied. And for some reason, they have difficulty in defending. And it's sometimes quite easy for people who haven't been bullied or are not in the position of being bullied at that time to say, oh, just stand up for yourself, don't let them treat you like that. But there is something there within that relationship between the person who's being bullied and the person who's bullied that makes it difficult to defend yourself. And that's why bullying can happen. And then the behaviour is often intentional. Now this is quite a controversial attribute, but I think it's an important one to include. And I mean, I've sort of been a bit shy in saying it's always intentional. Part of me feels that yes, it is. People will insist, no, I didn't mean to act in that way. But the thing is that whenever I spoke to the student midwives, they told me that mostly the midwives did know what they were doing, because they spoke to them, they said to them, I don't like the way you're treating me, and they still did it. So they can't say that they didn't know. There was intent there. And the psychologists will also tell you that all human behaviour is intentional, really. Be it subconscious or otherwise, there is some degree of intent there. And then also to look at the background, you need to also think a bit like these reasons about why bullying can happen. And I was looking, if you think specifically about midwifery. And really, one of the very important things about bullying is that it's down to the perception of the person who has been bullied. it's very easy for someone to say, you're not being bullied. If I'm being bullied and I feel I'm being bullied and I perceive that I'm being bullied, then I'm being bullied. And it's very easy for people to pass it off as you being too sensitive, too anxious, just takes things too seriously. The reality is, if someone's being bullied, they need to be taken seriously. And if they feel it, if they tell you that's what's happening, you need to listen to them. Another thing that can happen within midwifery that can in some way lead to bullying is this lack of control that many midwives feel about their area of work. We are meant to be autonomous practitioners who have this right to work autonomously on our own responsibility. The reality for many of us within clinical practice is we don't work in that way. We work very tightly within very rigid guidelines that are imposed on us many times from on high, from organisations outside our trust, within our trust, from other professions, from our own profession. And this can leave many midwives feeling extremely frustrated, and they lash out. And that's really, we get this horizontal bullying where they sort of bully the people around them. And then power distance. This can also be a reason why people are bullied, because people feel that they can't in some way react or respond. And within our NHS, in which many midwives work, there are lots of instances of power distance. We have great hierarchies. I know we all like to pretend we don't, but we do. We have great hierarchies, and people feel that they can't respond because it will impact, they'll get moved off the ward where they love working, they can't respond to this threat from someone who's bullying them. And don't get me wrong, sometimes managers are just as open to bullying as employees or the midwives who are working for them. It isn't always a top-down approach. It can quite often be the other way around. And permissive culture. It's very clear there is a permissive culture within midwifery for bullying. If it wasn't tolerated, if we didn't want it in the profession, okay, quite naively it would be easy to say it would never exist, but there would be a lot less of it. The fact is, we allow it to happen. And it was interesting, in the focus groups, many of those experienced midwives, and I'll talk a little about them later, but they said they often felt ashamed that they had seen it happen to colleagues. They didn't intervene. And why? Because they're afraid it was happened to them. They ducked their head down, they kept out of the way, and they let it happen. So there is still that degree. We don't intervene, we let it happen. We might sympathise with somebody behind closed doors, but we don't do it in public, and we allow it to happen. So that permissive culture pervades it all. And then the consequences. Well, I've divided these, just for simplicity, into the individual, professional and organisational consequences. And they're far-reaching. As an individual, the minimum that you can suffer is some distress, ill health, going out of work, taking time off sick, leaving your job, leaving midwifery. That's not much, is it? As a profession, we are losing many midwives at a time when we're trying to recruit, retain, bring people into our profession, tell people we're a lovely profession to come into. We are losing people from our profession because we are not treating each other very well. And then the organisational losses are great as well, because again, it costs a lot to recruit, retain, to attract the right people. You want to keep the people there. You want to build up a team spirit. You can't do that if you're continually losing people, or if you have people who are continually going off sick because of the stress related to the bullying that they're being exposed to. So it has major far-reaching consequences right throughout the organisation, but equally for that individual, they will continually suffer. So the confirmatory focus groups. A concept analysis is really, as I said, quite an academic thing that you sort of think is quite removed from practice. And in order to try and look to sort of bring the concept of bullying back into practice and sort of set it within the context of midwifery, we undertook focus groups with experienced midwives with backgrounds from midwifery managers and practising midwives, and I've made the difference there because those two groups of people didn't want to be in focus groups together. I had many people who said, I won't speak if there are managers there, and there's some managers who weren't willing to speak if there were midwives there. So we had to split the groups. We also had academic midwives, and we also had midwives that were involved in unions, so union representatives who also represented midwives. And they confirmed what I had identified, what had been identified within the concept analysis. They confirmed the defining attributes. They thought that they made sense to them. They confirmed the antecedents and the consequences. So what I did then was I thought, right, okay, I've got to this point, but what do I do now? What else do I want to find out? And I felt that I wanted to speak to people who perhaps were not quite as socialised into profession as experienced or registered midwives are. So I wanted to speak to people who perhaps hadn't been quite tainted by that sort of culture or permissive culture that we have within midwifery to bullying. So we developed a questionnaire, survey questionnaire, using not only the literature that had been reviewed, but also the findings from the focus groups and the concept analysis. Nearly forgot about that, how could I? So the survey questionnaire then, that was a 28 question, open and closed ended, because obviously it's quite easy, it's great to have some things that you can stick into SBS and throw out a few numbers here and there. But particularly in a subject area like like this, you really want to allow people to give you some sort of feel for what their own experience was. And the questionnaire was distributed, as Ken had said, the RCM were very helpful in allowing me to get access to student midwives, because one of the great difficulties is it's very difficult to actually get speaking to your colleagues. I mean, I have recently received a questionnaire that has been distributed out through the RCM because people are trying to get information about us, but they've no other way of getting in contact with you. So for me to get actual access to student midwives was very difficult. So thankfully it was facilitated. I mean, I couldn't, for example, just choose the student midwives in Northern Ireland because there would have been totally no anonymity for them, would have been easily recognisable, and you just couldn't do it, it wouldn't have worked. So I needed to go UK-wide. So thankfully that was facilitated. So the main findings, and this is really from the student questionnaire. 36% of the student midwives had been bullied. So that's over a third of those student midwives. And another third had witnessed bullying. So when you do a bit of maths, taking into account those who had experienced and/or all of that, you come up with about half of those student midwives had either experienced or witnessed bullying. And if you think back to when I said that, you know, most of us, if we see someone else being bullied, we sort of put our head down, that obviously has an impact on you as well, because it makes you think, I need to watch, I need to behave, I need to conform, I need to watch that person. So it does have an impact, even if it's not you being bullied. And who was the bully? It was usually more than one person. Midwives like to work in packs, yeah? As one of our associate dean would call us, a delivery of midwives. When he sees a lot of midwives together, oh dear, here's a delivery of midwives. More than one person, okay? So, you know, we have our little cliques. We've all seen it. A midwife, so just one midwife who picked on them, bullied them, decided. A mentor. Now, considering that a lot of clinical assessments for students are based on the assessment by their mentor, perhaps taking other staff's, other midwives' what's I going to say? Knowledge and understanding of the student's work into account. But if you take that it's the mentor who is going to make a decision about whether that student passes or fails. Ward sister? I don't think any of you could believe that. University lecture? Of course not. But it does happen. And when you consider that our students spend 50% of their time in clinical practice and 50% in the university, there's ample opportunities, and usually they're visited by the university lecturers as well. There's ample opportunity for students to be bullied by the university lecturers. Indeed, anecdotally here, I spoke to a mixed group of health professionals, and I had a guy come up to me and said his wife had left because she'd been bullied by a university lecturer. So it's clear, it's out there. Midwifery supervisor, and they're meant to be our protectors, our helpers, our friends. And I used to be one of them. Now, nature of bullying. What sort of behaviours are we talking about? We're talking about excessive criticism, intimidation, belittling work, undervaluing efforts. Now, I know that people will say, and the response to this is always, oh, but students don't like you telling them they're doing something wrong. But this was more, there's ways of doing it. This was being criticised in front of others, being put, in front of mothers, in front of other midwives, in front of student midwives, in front of doctors, and it was excessive. It wasn't just your average, listen, I think you could do this a bit better. Excessive monitoring, questioning competence, changing goalposts. That's a good one. You know, somebody tells you do it like that, you go and do it like that. No, what are you doing like that for? Do it like this. You go and do it like that. What are you doing it like that for? Do it like this. And continually. And these are people who are trying to impress us, remember. Student midwives spend their life to help them, trying to impress others around them, that they're good, that they know what they're doing, that they're competent. How can they possibly do that if we keep changing it for them? How many cotton wool balls? Where do you put the bowls? All that sort of stuff. Okay, withholding information, and that's a classic one, you know, just not telling people enough information and then blaming them when they've got it wrong. Malicious lies. Midwives would never do that. Verbal abuse. There was also some physical abuse. There were 2 instances where a student midwife had a bag of waste thrown at her and another student midwife was pushed and pulled around. So, the consequences. Loss of confidence. Don't know why that would have happened. Loss of self-esteem. Anxiety. Now remember, we rely very heavily on these student midwives to help us care for our women. And they're going along in this state of total lack of confidence, lack of self-esteem, anxiety, constantly thinking, am I doing this right, or am I going to get bullied again? Thought about leaving the course. That's quite a large number who thought that they would leave the course because they've been bullied. And very sadly, 1 student midwife had contemplated suicide. Now that is not unknown. Hasty in 1995, for example, recalls a midwife who did commit suicide as a result of the way she had been bullied by her colleagues, in part because of the way she'd been treated. So it's not an unknown phenomenon, and the RCM have reported it as well. So, in their own words, and I sort of just categorise this under the defining attributes just to give it a little bit of structure and order. The repeated nature, and this is what the student midwives said. Personally criticised, information withheld, told not to ask questions. As a student, why would you want to ask questions? Didn't feel respected or valued, and being humiliated and not nurtured. And there's someone who came in believing she would be nurtured. And I'm saying she because I didn't have any male respondents. Questioning and challenging every little task and belittling them in front of women and their families. You think how that makes the woman feel. There was something, a little bit that came out in the focus groups which said, yes, you know, some women do say, oh, don't send me to that ward, because they know what the staff are like, or they know the atmosphere in the ward. So this is filtering through to the women that we care for. So the negative effect, how did it impact on them? And this is just one of the student midwife stories. Sister belittled her, just asking her if she was going to do any work or stare, you know, sitting there and staring at the anaesthetist all night. You can imagine it, you can see the scenario. And that means that you know what it's like. You can't even perform the most basic of tasks when somebody's getting at you. And she considered about leaving the course at that time and really was very anxious because, you know, they tend to rotate back into the same practice areas. So she was afraid that she was going to have to meet this person again. And finding it difficult to defend yourself. You know, how do you stand up and make a fuss whenever you know that you're going to be labelled a troublemaker? It's easier to keep your head down and get on with it. Similar to what the midwives said in the focus groups. And afraid to complain because of poor grades, no job opportunities. Because sometimes trusts will link in your, you know, if you're on a particular course, they'll say, right, we'll give you a job afterwards. But if you've been labelled a troublemaker, that's not going to happen. And the intent of the bully. It was clear. She knew what she was doing and how it made me feel because I told her and she continued to do it. Can't be said any clearer than that. She does it so often it's natural to her. I mean, one of the midwives boasted that she hadn't had a student who got to 3rd year yet. And I don't think she likes students. So, after all of that, what I came up with was a revised definition, and it included the defining attributes. So it's now even more difficult to say, because it's often intentional, repeated, persistent, offensive, abusive, intimidating, malicious, insulting behaviour, abuse of power, unfair penal sanctions, against which the victim finds it difficult to defend him or herself. It has a negative effect on the recipient, which makes them feel upset, threatened, humiliated, vulnerable, undermines their self-confidence, and can cause them to suffer stress. So finally, this research provides evidence of bullying within the clinical and university settings, and that's something new. Really, it hadn't been identified that it was happening within the universities. Anecdotally, absolutely. And bullying in midwifery has now been identified, defined, validated and confirmed. There is a need to raise awareness of bullying in midwifery. And I think every time I present this paper, it's interesting how many people come up and say that they're glad that I've presented because it is helping to raise awareness. And if that's the least I can do, I have other plans to do more, but if that's the very least I can do, at least I feel that's something. That's a positive contribution. And there is a need to engage professional and statutory organisations in the prevention and management of bullying in midwifery. And I mean, I have spoken with the RCM and they are very receptive, and as I've said, they were the leaders in some way of trying to say that bullying was an issue and that they needed to be able to respond to it in a positive way. And I've spoken to people in the NMC, and I know they have their difficulties at the moment, but they weren't particularly receptive to thinking that this was something they wanted to legislate or put something in writing on. So, my sincere thanks to my supervisors, Marlene Sinclair, I think you may know her, and Professor George Kernahan, one of the few men in the room, and I'm really indebted to both of them. And, sorry, Joe on the video camera. I really am indebted to them because they kept me going when the going got tough, and let me tell you, the going got tough. The research participants, absolutely. I mean, they were so brave to come forward and talk to me in many instances, to give me their time, to give me their energy, to all of that. And the student midwives as well. I mean, they took time to fill in a questionnaire, which I'm sure they really thought, oh, do I have to? But they said they wanted to because they thought it was an important subject. It was something they wanted to respond to. The RCM, in particular the Ruth Davies Research Bursary, because it did help an awful lot. It gave me a little bit of slush fund there to help me get this research done, help me travel, let me disseminate some of my research, was brilliant. And to Bounty and the DMRS, because I have now published this in this research summary. And I never thought I would get there, to be honest. But Marlene says that's always me, really, isn't it? I never think I'll get there, but somehow I do. So thank you all too for coming along and listening.